All right, today we're going to talk about how to graph lines in slope-intercept form and also determining slope from in a couple different ways, including 2 points. So we need to talk about a couple of things first, some definitions. So slope is a ratio, which means it's a fraction, and a fraction will have two numbers. And so it's going to be the distance up and down on a graph. Because we're talking about graphs with slope, the top number will be the distance up and down. It'll be up if the top number is positive, and down if the top number is negative. And then we're always going to go to the right, and there's a way we can do it. Sometimes we go to the left, but those are exceptions. And once you learn this way, going left and backwards is pretty easy. So again, the slope would be two numbers. If the number is positive, we go up. If the number is negative, we go down, and we always go to the right. All right, the y-intercept becomes pretty important for us, and that's going to be where the graph crosses the y-axis. And again, the y-axis is the vertical axis. The x-intercept is something that is there, but we don't talk about it a lot in this class. This would be where the graph crosses the x-axis. This is something covered more in algebra class, not so much in geometry. All right, so there's two types of forms that we deal with. One form is called slope-intercept form. And in this form, the slope is the m. The b value in the equation is the y-intercept, which is where we get slope-intercept from. Now, you have to know the slope comes from m and that m is the slope. Depends on the types of problems, you'll see these interchanged. All right, so you need to be able to identify slope from this equation because in the next few lessons, we're going to talk about some slope relationships where this will either stay the same or be changed. This y-intercept will become pretty important in the next lessons. So this material right here is background for what will be needed for the further upcoming lessons. All right, so let's go through an example of identifying slope and y-intercept and also graphing. So in this first example here, the -2 would be the slope. So -2 would be here. And what that means, because it's a -2, it's actually over the number 1 because it has to be two numbers in a fraction. So the -2 tells us we're going to go down 2 and then 1 to the right. The b value in this problem is +8. Now, when we graph this equation, I'll explain where we get this from. The first step in graphing this equation is we have to graph the y-intercept. So the y-intercept is +8, and so we graph it here. One way to remember this is the y-intercept is b, and so we begin with b. Now, from this particular point, okay, so we graph that. From this particular point, we use the slope to graph a second point. So the slope over here told us to go 2 down and 1 right. So 2 down and 1 right would graph our second point. We could continue graphing points if we wanted to, but for this type of problem, that would be sufficient. Okay. Now, if we look at another example where the slope is actually a fraction. So in this case, the slope would be 3/4, which means we go 3 up and 4 to the right. The b value is -7. So again, to graph this, we first are going to begin with the b value with -7. So we graph -7 on the y-axis. Then we use our slope to find the next point. So we go up 3 and then right 4 to plot our second point. So that gives us some background on how to graph an equation in slope-intercept form, how to identify slope, and how to identify the y-intercept. All right, the next form that we'll talk about briefly is called point-slope form. And in this case, you're given a point and you'll be given the slope. And from there, you need to come up with this equation. We'll just briefly talk about the equation. We will use this form more for graphing to find an answer more than the algebra component. This will be something that we covered in Algebra 1 in more depth from the equation component. But what ends up happening is this is the first time we see an equation in class where there's a negative sign. And I want to bring this up, this is important. Anytime there's a negative sign in a formula, we want to think of the word opposite or change the sign. So this formula says we're going to do y and then change the sign of the y coordinate. So in this particular problem here, this is the y coordinate. So in our formula, this will become a -4. This is our x value. So over here, we have the equal sign, and then m. Again, m is slope, so the slope would be 3. And then it's x, and then change the sign of the x value. So the x value would become a +1. So if we take our equation here, I tried to highlight these to illustrate this. So remember, the y in our formula, or in our point, sorry, was +4. And when we plug it in our formula, it becomes a -4. The slope was 3, which should be pretty easy to understand. and then the x value was -1 here, and we changed the sign to make it a +1. This is all that I would expect you to know how to do, and we don't really talk too much of it beyond this, but you should know how to graph something in this form. So if we were graphing something in this form, the first step would be to graph this. The first thing would be to plot the point. Okay, so we plot the point on the graph. The second would be to use the slope to plot more points until we get to the y-intercept. So that would be the goal of graphing. You plot the point and then continue going. And if we were to do the algebra of this, it would match the graph equation as well. So we'll talk more about this in a couple days, but this would be how you would graph a point slope formula. All right, down here, same thing. What we'll do here is this y value will change to a +6. The -8 of the slope just goes in for m, and then the +3 of the point ends up becoming a -3. Okay, the next thing here, I'm going to change up this problem slightly. It says write an equation in point slope form. All I want to do right now is actually talk about what is the slope from 2 points. That's something that's required that will be asked on quizzes and tests. So I want to talk about that. So I want just the slope from the 2 points. So I want to make sure that's clear to you guys. Right? So the slope formula is y minus y over x minus x, and that's going to equal to m, or the slope. Now sometimes in books you'll see something like this, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And I have found that sometimes that can be confusing what the 2 and the 1 and that kind of thing is. So what I'm hoping that you'll see in this is a simpler way to do it. So what I did is I highlighted the green, and the green is going to refer to this coordinate, the first coordinate. And again, this is x, and that would be y. So the first coordinate, y value, goes up top. And in this case, it's going to be -9. The first value, x coordinate, goes underneath it, which would be 4. So what I recommend doing is taking the first coordinate, putting the y value on top, the x value on the bottom. Now we have a second coordinate here, and that's going to go into these spots here. Now because it's a negative sign, we're going to change the sign of that value. So in this problem, the y value is +1, so we're going to change that to become a -1. So now the top would read -9 minus 1. The -1 for an x value would change on the bottom, so that would become a +1. So we have 4 plus 1. So we can put this in the calculator, or maybe you can do it mentally, and we would get a slope of -2. So what we're going to end up doing with this is once you're able to do that, we're going to use some properties of slope to determine some other types of problems that will come up in the next couple lessons. All right, horizontal vertical lines are some things that come in. These are special cases. The first is a horizontal line, right? So if we're given the point -5, -7, which is here, and we go horizontal, right, we find out that every point on this line has a y value equal to -7, all the way over here. Now, in this case, if we were to use the slope idea, right, we start from the left and we determine up and down. We go 0 up, right, 0 up and any number to the right. And then it crosses the y-intercept at -7. So in slope-intercept form, that's what we would get. But now 0 divided by 1 is actually 0. And so our equation would end up being just y equals -7. Now, this is quite a simple problem, but most students do get confused. So you do need to know how the horizontal line equation is and how to be able to graph that. All right, so if we have a horizontal equation, we're also going to have a vertical one. So now in this case, a vertical line is going to have every point going through the same x value. So in this case, the x value is -3. So in this problem, everyone will have an x value of -3. Now this is going to be different because the equation is x equals -3. This isn't in slope-intercept form. The slope for this is actually what we call undefined. The slope for the horizontal line is what we call 0. And they are not the same. 0 does not mean undefined. 0 means there's no change in height. Undefined means it's a vertical line. And we don't get into too much detail on what undefined is, we just need to know that it's undefined.